of a dysfunctional family. But it's an epic story of so many intersections and places in which we can find ourselves. The main character is Joseph. And Joseph is the son of Jacob, one of 12 sons, second to the youngest. Joseph has an interesting life, for his father favors him because Joseph is the son of his beloved wife, one of 4 wives, but the one who he loves the most. There's favoritism. You hear it. And Jacob goes around and tells everyone that Joseph is his favorite, and he shows it by giving Joseph this cloak. And Joseph wears this proudly. Again, favorites. What parent would choose one child over another? But we see it very often in life. We see it in this story. And so Joseph, being young and not very wise and a little proud, goes around and brags to his brothers about this cloak and the fact that he'll probably get a double inheritance of his father's estate. And then Joseph starts to have dreams which are a gift from God. And instead, in his young age of saying, I think I'll tuck this dream in my back pocket and ponder it, what does he do? But he goes to his brothers and he says, let me tell you about this dream. I dreamt that you were bowing down to me. Now, I don't know about your families, but that would never sit well in mine. There were 5 of us, and we struggled for equal power. We certainly would not have wanted to hear that somebody in the family was boss, and somebody was not. And so it further creates this dysfunction in this family. And so as the story goes, you know that if you've read the Old Testament story in Genesis, you know that the brothers got pretty fed up with this other brother who thought that he was all that. And as his father had asked him to go and tattletale on his brothers, go and check on them and find out what they might be doing, and then come back and report to me. They had it. And they said, we're done. Let's get rid of him. Let's kill him. Let's kill a wild animal, and we'll smear blood on his cloak, and we'll go back home and go, Dad, you know what happened? Sorry, we lost a brother. Except that one of them steps in and says, you know, I think we could do this and actually make money because I see a caravan coming down the road of Ishmaelites, and hey, we could just sell them. We could be done with them, but the blood wouldn't be on our shoulders, and we get a half a day's wage for it. So that's what they did. They took Joseph out of the dry cistern and they sold him to this caravan of Ishmaelites, and Joseph goes to Egypt. Now at that point, if that were me, I'd have a good whine going on. I would be whining to God, I would be angry, and I would be seeking some revenge. I at least would say, I'm going to escape out of here and I'm going back and I am going to get justice, because that's what we do when we're wronged. But this story doesn't tell us that that's what Joseph did. In fact, Joseph is sold to Potiphar, and Joseph becomes a loyal, trusted slave. Once a freed man, Joseph decides, I'm going to do the next right thing. And I'm going to be the best I can be for Potiphar. And so he gains the trust of Potiphar. And things seem to have righted themselves. Have you been there in your life? Where things happen and you just feel like so much injustice, and then all of a sudden the tide turns, and you start to breathe a sigh of relief, and you start to think, okay, all right, I have my life back, and so here we go, and you get knocked down again. Because Potiphar had a wife who thought Joseph was good looking. And Potiphar's wife just constantly said, Joseph, come lie with me. Joseph, come lie with me. Joseph, come lie with me. And Joseph resisted that temptation. He said no. And one day, when Potiphar's wife was alone with Joseph, she said, Joseph, come lie with me. And Joseph said, I cannot disgrace my master. I can't make this be right. And so he flees, and she grabs his outer garment. And she's a woman spurned, and so she goes out and she says, you tried to take advantage of me. We don't believe a slave, do we? We believe those in power. And so Joseph is thrown into prison. his life that just begins to right itself gets slammed down again. And once again in prison. You would think if it were you or me that injustice would happen to, oh, we'd be angry. We'd be whining and we'd be seeking vengeance. None of that is in this story. And it's not because it was a good story and they decided to leave it out. Truly, what we see is Joseph is in this wilderness place and he allows God to shape him. This is where in prison, when things can't get any worse, that God starts peeling away that ego. Where God starts to mature this young man. Where God starts to shape him. Because isn't that true in your life? It's true in mine. Isn't it true that sometimes in the very worst place you can find yourself, that's where God can do the shaping? It's not that God brings you to that place. It's not that God causes that place. God doesn't waste a moment of our lives. And so sometimes in the very worst of it, in the very despairing places, in the very hopeless places, in the very places of injustice, God says, let me shape you. Let me chip away, chisel. Let me mold. Because this is really the best place for that to be done. And so that happens to Joseph, and he really starts gaining the respect because he makes a decision. I'm going to do the next right thing. See, sometimes it's just that simple. I'm just going to put my foot in front of the other. I don't understand the injustice. I don't understand why this person is coming after me, but I'm going to do the next right thing because that's the only thing in my power to do. And I'm going to trust that God will equal the injustice somewhere, somehow, if not in all eternity. And so Joseph gains the respect, and people in prison are having dreams, and Joseph realizes that God has given him this ability way back when he was young to interpret dreams. So he starts to interpret them, and he gives all the credit to God. And then Pharaoh, the big king of the land, has a dream. And it unsettles his heart so much, and he looks out at his seers, and he says, tell me what this dream means. I think it's significant, and none of them can tell. None of them can tell Pharaoh anything about the dream. But one of them, who is a recipient of Joseph's next right thing, says, Pharaoh, there was this guy in prison, and he interpreted a dream for me, and it all came true just as he said. And Pharaoh said, send for him. And so Joseph is brought before Pharaoh, and he's able to interpret this dream that affects not just Joseph, not just Pharaoh, but all the land. And the dream is that 7 years they're going to have plenty, and then 7 years they're going to have famine. And Pharaoh listens to this. Pharaoh's not a believer of the God Almighty, but Pharaoh hears truth. And he says, I know that your God has given you this gift because you're crediting God. And I know that this is the interpretation of my dream. And so he hands over the reins to the kingdom to Joseph, a slave, a Jew. And he says, Joseph, I need you to care for these things. And so Joseph is that little boy in the dry cistern of a well, not having anything. Life is over, no hope. To now, a position of power and prestige, holding the keys and the prosperity of the land. And so as any good storyteller in the Hebrew Bible, as they tell this story and they're seeking to entertain their audience, but they're also seeking to tell truth, to give a lesson. And so the story could end right there, but it doesn't. Because the story's not finished. And so what happens is there comes a time when Jacob is looking out at his sons and they're starving out in the wilderness. And he says, there's food in Egypt. They've taken provisions. Go to Egypt and beg, do whatever you have to, but get us food that we don't die. And who do they go to? These brothers that sought to kill Joseph. Now, outside of their understanding, are bowing before Joseph, begging for the bread of life. Begging for the bread of life. And Joseph recognizes them. And Joseph, because of the work that he has done in his own wilderness journey, is ready for this response. Joseph, when seeing his brothers, could no longer control himself. himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, "Have everyone leave my presence!" So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. And Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, Come close to me." They had done so. He said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one that you sold into Egypt. But now, do not be distressed, and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been a famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will not be any plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. Would you or I have such a response? The psalmist says this: "How good and pleasant it is when brothers live together in unity," and that includes you, sisters. "It is like precious oil poured on the head, running down on the beard, running down on Aaron's beard, down upon the collar of his robes. It is as if the dew of Hermon were falling on Mount Zion." That's the pleasure of brothers and sisters living together in unity. For there the Lord bestows his blessing, even life forevermore. So you have heard the story. And you can say it's a great story. So let's just leave it there. Let's leave it a Hebrew Bible story. Let's leave it a story where Joseph was this incredible superhero of the faith. And he was able to just extend forgiveness where it would be illogical for us to ever even dream of forgiving. But that story, if we're going to be authentic and true believers of Christ, that story needs to be our story. So where do you offer reconciliation to others? Where is it that you need to give over some of the resentment that you hold against an issue, against a person, against a situation, against your past? To be able to understand that you're the one in prison when you hang on to them, that you and I need to be set free. In doing my sermon work, I came across a story of a gentleman named Darrell Burton. In 1985, Darrell Burton was getting gas just like you and I would be. He was a dark-colored African American. But while getting gas, someone went into the store and held up the attendant and subsequently shot the attendant and killed him. This went to trial. And somehow someone said that although the person that did the shooting was African American and very light-colored skin, Darrell was accused of that murder. And here is his story.
You know, I got teased a lot by my skin complexion. But that became my saving grace. Thank God for that.
Darrell Burton told this story to a standing room only crowd inside of the lecture and conference room of Emerson Library. It began with a murder at a gas station.
3, 4 people gave a description the night this crime was committed to the police. And they said the person they observed was about 5 feet 5, 5 feet 6 inches tall, medium to light skin.
The unmatched description didn't matter.
The lady who was representing me had a sidebar with the prosecution and stipulated with the prosecution not to mention this other suspect.
Burton was charged with murder and sent to maximum security prison.
I've seen evil that none of you have ever seen, or few of you ever will. And so I began to write a lot of motions. Deny.
So Burton began writing hundreds of letters. Finally, in 1990, an administrator from New Jersey agreed to take his case in 10 years. In 2000, the trial was reopened for another 8 years. Previously dismissed evidence that a witness saved Burton.
When she was at my trial back in 1985, and she told the police at my trial, "You have the wrong man. That's not the man I saw commit this crime. That man is too dark."
The charges were reversed, and Burton was able to see his daughter for the first time in 24 years.
It's a storybook. It almost seems like kind of unreal. Kind of rarely hear about stuff like this.
Spirituality was found in Burton, and he holds no grudge.
I'm not bitter. I'm better.
For the Webster Weekly Report, I'm Matt Bright.
Could that be you? Could that be me? This man was wrongfully accused, negated by society, and his life for 25 years was not just over, but he was placed in a prison where heinous things were done to him. This is a man who stands in front of audiences all over the world, is now in theology school, to become articulate enough to address any audience that he can talk to about reconciliation and forgiveness. This is a man who says, it didn't make me bitter, it made me better. See, that's unworldly. That's something that you and I can't grasp unless we have Christ in our lives. And here's the thing that Darrell Burton says that just will always stick in my heart. He said this, "I believe in my wilderness journey. I believe in the darkest place where I found myself, as unjust as it was, I believe that it was in that moment that God could work out of me the things that God needed to work out of me, so that God could work in me the things that only God could place within me, in order that God would work through me, that I might shine with Jesus." Now, each one of you sitting here or listening via internet can think of a time when you can authentically say, "I have been wronged, and it was unjust. It wasn't fair. It wasn't my doing. It wasn't my making." And Joseph comes out from the Old Testament to ask us, so what are you going to do about it? Because if you hang on to all of those grievances, if you hang on to all that resentment, you're the one in prison. You placed yourself in prison. And it's time to let it go. It's time to say, "God, could you work in me to get out the stuff that needs to come out, so that you can put the things that are good in your heart and place them in my life, so that you can work through me, because I'm stuck. We'll always be stuck." Now, I have to tell you that when you read that story, when Joseph met with his brothers, there was accountability. Did you hear when I read that he said, "I am the brother that you sold into Egypt"? This is not one of these, "Oh yes, no, it's fine, everything's good, no, I've forgotten about it long ago." This is being real and authentic with reconciliation, and that's holding accountability. It's letting others know this was the wrong and this is the pain that I've suffered in my heart. But it's a surrendering to let God do God's work, of releasing you and releasing me from that stuff, so that we have the ability to move on. So the question this morning is, as you think of that one thing or that one person that you say, "I cannot forgive, and I have every reason not to forgive them," the question is, are you willing to let God work to release that stuff that needs to go, to put in the stuff that God wants for your life, so that you have peace and your joy, so that God can work through you, so that you shine, so that others others might see the King. That followers of Christ are different than what the world would ever advise you. Followers of Christ, forgive. Shall we pray? Oh God. There are so many injustices that we live day in and day out. Some of them against us, some of them institutions. We see the rich and we see the poor. We see the literate and we see the illiterate. We see the young and we see the old. We see so many opposites, oh God. And you call to us in that still small voice to be people of peace and people that are willing to forgive. And we acknowledge that this is not within us to do. Joseph teaches us that it's only by looking to you and trusting you and doing the next right thing that we are truly free. So this morning, if God is whispering in your soul, just whisper back, Lord, would you release this stuff that I've been hanging on to? Lord, would you plant in me your love and the deep seeds of peace and contentment? And God, would you use me that my life might shine